I was standing in the middle of my own baby shower, surrounded by pink balloons and the scent of vanilla cake, when my sister looked at the DNA ancestry kit someone had given me as a gag gift, and said those 4 words that shattered everything. "That's impossible, ma'am." Her face had gone completely white, and she was staring at her phone screen like it contained news of a death. What she had discovered in those results would expose a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for 32 years. And it would cost me everything I thought I knew about my life. But here is the part that no one expected, including me. What I did next changed not just my story but hers too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My life had followed a trajectory that made sense on paper. Good schools, better internships, a position at a prestigious firm by the time I was 25, and a steady climb up the ladder that rewarded competence and punished sentiment. I married Daniel when I was 28. After 3 years of dating that felt practical rather than passionate but in ways that seemed mature and sustainable. He worked in commercial real estate development, which meant our dinner conversations often revolved around market trends, zoning regulations, and the economic factors driving urban growth. We were compatible in the ways that mattered for building a stable life together. We wanted similar things, operated on similar timelines, and rarely fought because we had learned to negotiate rather than argue. Our friends called us the power couple, though I always detected a faint undertone in that phrase that suggested something clinical rather than romantic. When I discovered I was pregnant at 31, the timing aligned perfectly with the 5-year plan we had discussed during our engagement. Daniel responded to the news with genuine happiness tempered by immediate practical considerations about nursery logistics, healthcare plans, and how my maternity leave would affect our financial projections. I had expected nothing different. This was who we were, people who planned, people who prepared, people who controlled variables to minimize uncertainty. The pregnancy progressed without complications through the fall and into winter, my body changing in ways that felt both miraculous and strange, as though I were becoming someone new while still remaining fundamentally myself. My sister Corinne lived in Seattle, about 3 hours north, where she worked as a freelance graphic designer, and lived in a small house in Ballard with her husband Marcus and their 2 children. We had grown up in Sacramento, the daughters of parents who divorced when I was 12 and she was 9, splitting our childhood between 2 households that could not have been more different. Our mother remarried quickly to a man named Robert who worked in insurance and lived in a planned community where every lawn looked identical. Our father remained single for years before eventually moving to Arizona with a woman he met online, someone we saw perhaps twice a year if the holidays aligned properly. Corinne and I had been close as children in the way that sisters often are when their world feels unstable, clinging to each other as the one constant while everything else shifted. But as we grew older and our paths diverged, that closeness had faded into something more polite and distant, the kind of relationship maintained through birthday calls and occasional visits, rather than daily intimacy. Corinne had always been the creative one, the daughter who painted and wrote poetry and chose experience over security. She had traveled through Europe in her early 20s with nothing but a backpack and a willingness to sleep on strangers' couches. She had waitressed, bartended, and worked retail while building her design portfolio, never seeming bothered by the financial instability that would have given me panic attacks. She married Marcus when she was 26, a musician who taught guitar lessons and played weekend gigs at bars around Seattle. They had 2 daughters, ages 7 and 5, and lived a life that seemed perpetually one emergency away from disaster but somehow never quite collapsed. I loved my sister, but I also could not understand her choices, and I suspected she viewed my life with similar incomprehension, as though we spoke related but fundamentally different languages. When I told Corinne about the pregnancy, her response had been warm and enthusiastic in ways that felt genuine. She called me every few weeks to check in, asking questions about how I was feeling and sharing stories from her own pregnancies that made the experience feel less clinical and more human. She offered to help plan the baby shower, insisting that I deserved celebration even though I had initially resisted the idea as unnecessarily sentimental. I had eventually agreed, partly because Daniel thought it would be good for office relationships if I invited some colleagues, and partly because Corinne's enthusiasm was difficult to resist once she committed to something. She drove down to Portland 2 weeks before the scheduled date to help with preparations, staying in our guest room and filling the apartment with an energy that felt simultaneously comforting and slightly overwhelming. The shower itself was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in late February, when Portland weather hovered between winter rain and the first hints of spring. We had rented a private room at a restaurant downtown that specialized in brunch, a bright space with large windows and exposed brick walls that Corinne had decorated with pink and gold streamers, balloons in various shades of rose, and a banner that read "Welcome Baby Girl" in elegant script. I had invited about 30 people, a mix of work colleagues, college friends who still lived in the area, a few neighbors from our building, and some of Daniel's female relatives who had expressed interest in attending. Corinne had invited some of her friends from Seattle who had made the drive down, women I vaguely remembered from previous visits but did not know well. My mother had flown in from Sacramento, though my father had declined, citing prior commitments that he did not elaborate on. Robert, my stepfather, had stayed home, which surprised no one since he generally avoided events that required emotional presence. The shower unfolded in the predictable rhythms of such gatherings. Women arrived with wrapped gifts and enthusiastic greetings, balancing plates of quiche and fruit, while navigating conversations with people they may or may not have met before. There were games involving guessing the baby's weight and length, writing advice on cards that would supposedly guide me through early motherhood, and a seemingly endless parade of tiny clothing items that provoked collective cooing. I smiled through it all, genuinely grateful for the thoughtfulness while also feeling slightly removed from the spectacle, as though I were watching myself participate rather than fully inhabiting the moment. Daniel had retreated to a coffee shop several blocks away, having been explicitly told that his presence was neither required nor desired at what Corinne called a women's space, though he had helped carry supplies in earlier that morning. About halfway through the afternoon, after most of the food had been consumed and the gift opening had begun, one of Corinne's friends, a woman named Jessica who worked in marketing and had a wickedly sarcastic sense of humor, presented me with a gift that drew immediate laughter from the assembled group. It was a DNA ancestry testing kit, still in its unopened box, the kind that promised to reveal ethnic heritage, trace migration patterns, and potentially connect users with distant relatives. Jessica announced that since I was bringing a new person into the world, perhaps I should figure out exactly what genetic legacy I was passing along, and besides, everyone was doing these tests now and discovering fascinating things about their backgrounds. The room erupted in knowing laughter because several women chimed in with stories of surprising discoveries they or people they knew had made through similar services, unexpected Scandinavian heritage, or distant cousins who had reached out through the platform. I accepted the gift with a smile, making some joke about hoping I was not secretly descended from someone notorious, and set it aside with the growing pile of presents. The moment should have passed into the comfortable blur of the afternoon, just another amusing gift among the practical ones. But Corinne had picked up the box, examining it with an expression that shifted from curiosity to something more intense. She looked at me, then at our mother who was sitting nearby, then back at the box in her hands. Her voice came out strangely careful when she asked whether I had ever done one of these tests before. I told her I had not, that I had never felt particularly curious about distant ancestry since our family history seemed straightforward enough. We were mutts, as our mother had always said. A little bit of everything mixed together over generations in ways that had ceased to matter once everyone arrived in California. Corinne had gone quiet then, an unusual state for someone who typically filled silences with observations and questions. She had turned the box over in her hands, reading the information on the back with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Then she said something that I initially dismissed as one of her impulsive ideas, but that would prove to be the hinge on which everything turned. She suggested we do the tests together, right now, both of us, since she had always been curious about the results and this seemed like a fun sisterly activity. She could order her own kit on her phone and have it shipped to my address, or better yet, we could go to a pharmacy after the shower and pick one up, then do the tests together that evening. It would be fun, she insisted, to compare our results and see whether we had different ethnic percentages, whether we shared the same maternal haplogroups, all the technical details that these companies provided. The suggestion had generated enthusiasm from several women in the room who found the spontaneity charming, and who offered their own encouragement that we should absolutely do it, that it would create a special memory connected to this day. Our mother had been less enthusiastic, making a dismissive comment about how these tests were overpriced entertainment that told you nothing meaningful, that family was about who raised you rather than genetic markers, and that we should not waste money on trendy nonsense. Her reaction had struck me as oddly vehement for something so trivial, but I attributed it to her general skepticism about anything she perceived as frivolous spending. My mother had grown up with Depression-era parents who viewed waste as a moral failing, and she had inherited their suspicion of anything that seemed like luxury disguised as necessity. Corinne had pressed the issue, though, in ways that felt uncharacteristically insistent. She had already pulled out her phone and was looking up the nearest pharmacy that carried the tests, announcing that it was only 4 blocks away, and that she would run over right now to grab one for herself if I agreed to do mine. There was something in her voice that I could not quite identify, an urgency that seemed disconnected from the ostensible lightness of the suggestion. I remember looking at her carefully, trying to read what was happening beneath the surface, but her expression revealed nothing beyond enthusiastic encouragement. I had finally agreed, partly because refusing seemed churlish when she was so invested in the idea, and partly because several other women had joined in supporting the plan, making it feel like the shower's grand finale rather than a random tangent. Corinne had left immediately, practically jogging out of the restaurant, and returned 20 minutes later with another DNA kit still in its pharmacy bag. By then the shower was winding down, with guests beginning to make departure noises and gathering their coats and bags. A core group of about 8 women remained, including Jessica, who had given the original gift, 2 of my work colleagues, one of Daniel's cousins, Corinne's friend who had driven down from Seattle, my mother, Corinne, and myself. We had moved the remaining gifts and supplies to one side of the room and cleared space at the main table, where Corinne laid out both DNA kits with the ceremonial gravity of someone preparing for a ritual rather than a commercial genetics test. The actual process was simple and vaguely absurd, the 2 of us spitting into plastic tubes while the remaining women watched with the kind of fascination usually reserved for more meaningful activities. We sealed the tubes, registered our kits on the company's website using our phones, and packaged everything according to the instructions. Corinne had suggested we drop them in a mailbox immediately, as though speed mattered, and so the entire group had ended up walking several blocks through Portland's light rain to find a postal drop location, laughing at the ridiculousness of a baby shower ending with a quest to mail DNA samples. We had found a mailbox outside a convenience store, deposited both packages, and then said our goodbyes as people headed to their cars or called rideshares. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rest of that Sunday had passed in the comfortable exhaustion that follows social events, Daniel and I spending the evening organizing gifts and discussing names we had not yet settled on. Corinne had seemed distracted through dinner, checking her phone repeatedly and offering shorter responses than usual to Daniel's questions about her drive down and her impressions of Portland. I had attributed it to tiredness or perhaps some issue with Marcus or the girls that she was not mentioning, and I had not pressed her on it. She had left early Monday morning to drive back to Seattle, hugging me longer than usual at the door and telling me to call her immediately when the results came back, making me promise not to look at them without her. I had agreed, amused by her investment in what seemed like a minor diversion. The DNA results arrived 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in early April when spring had finally established itself in Portland, was experiencing the kind of weather that reminded people why they tolerated 9 months of rain. I had actually forgotten about the tests entirely, absorbed in the final preparations for the baby's arrival and managing a complex project at work that required unusual hours. The email notification appeared on my phone while I was finishing dinner. A simple message stating that my results were ready to view. I had called Corinne immediately, remembering my promise, and suggested we look at them together over video call since she had been so enthusiastic about the whole process. Corinne had answered on the second ring, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Her voice had a tight quality, controlled in ways that suggested she was working hard to sound normal. She had told me to wait, not to open the results yet, that she was going to look at hers first and then call me back. I had pushed back, reminding her that we had agreed to do this together, but she had been unusually firm, almost sharp, in insisting that I wait for her call. The conversation had ended awkwardly, with me confused and slightly irritated by her strange behavior. I had waited as requested, occupying myself with responding to work emails and straightening the apartment, expecting her to call back within minutes. An hour had passed with no word. Then 2 hours. I had texted her asking if everything was okay, receiving no response. By the time Daniel got home from a late meeting around 9, I had moved from confusion to concern, wondering whether something had happened with her family or whether she had seen something in her results that upset her. Daniel had suggested I just open mine and call her tomorrow, that she was probably dealing with some situation with the girls and had forgotten to call back. I had resisted, honoring my promise despite my growing curiosity and worry, and had finally gone to bed around 11 without hearing from her. Corinne had called at 6 in the morning, waking me from deep sleep with the aggressive buzzing of my phone on the nightstand. I had answered groggily, expecting an emergency, and had been met with her voice asking a single question that cut through my confusion like a knife. She asked whether our mother had ever said anything unusual about my birth, about the circumstances, about anything that seemed strange or incomplete in the story I had always been told. I had been too disoriented to process the question properly, asking what she was talking about, why she was calling so early, what this had to do with the DNA results. That was when Corinne had said the first part of what would become the earthquake. She told me that according to her DNA results, we were not full siblings. The genetic match between us indicated we were half-sisters, sharing approximately 25% of our DNA, rather than the 50% expected from full siblings with the same mother and father. She had spent the previous evening researching, consulting online forums, and even calling the company's customer service line to confirm that the results were accurate, and that this percentage definitively indicated a half-sibling relationship, rather than any kind of testing error or anomaly. I had sat up in bed, fully awake now, my mind racing through possibilities while simultaneously rejecting all of them. I had suggested that perhaps our father was not actually my father, that our mother had an affair before I was born, though the thought made me feel sick. That would explain the half-sibling relationship while keeping our mother as the common parent. But Corinne had already considered that possibility, and her response contained the detail that transformed confusion into something far more disturbing. She had told me that according to the detailed breakdown provided by the testing service, we did not share a maternal haplogroup, which was supposed to be identical for all people who shared a mother. The technical language was complex, but the implication was clear. If we were half-sisters who did not share maternal DNA, then logically we shared paternal DNA, which meant we had the same father but different mothers. The statement had seemed impossible, absurd, a mistake that would be corrected upon review. I had said exactly that, using the same tone I employed at work when someone presented me with numbers that did not make sense, calm and certain in my conviction that data this contradictory must contain an error. But Corinne had already spent hours investigating, and she had found no error. She had contacted the company, she had researched false positive rates, she had consulted genetic counseling resources online, and every source confirmed the same conclusion. The results indicated with over 99% certainty that we were paternal half-siblings, sharing a father but not a mother. I had gotten out of bed, leaving Daniel still sleeping, and had gone into the living room where early morning light was just beginning to filter through the windows. My hands had been shaking as I opened my laptop and logged into the DNA testing website, navigating to my results with a sense of dread that I could not fully explain. The ethnicity breakdown appeared first, showing percentages that seemed meaningless in that moment. Then came the relative matches, a list of people who had taken the same test and shared varying amounts of DNA with me. Corinne's name appeared near the top, listed as a close family match with the specific notation indicating half-sister. Below her name were several other matches labeled as distant cousins, people whose names meant nothing to me. But it was the notation beside Corinne's name that held my attention, that simple technical designation that contradicted everything I understood about my own existence. I had called Corinne back, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest, and had asked her to explain exactly what she thought this meant. She had taken a breath, and then she had said the thing that would haunt me for weeks afterward. She said that according to the DNA evidence, I was not our mother's biological daughter. That somehow, through circumstances we did not yet understand, the woman who had raised me was not genetically related to me. That my actual biological mother was someone else, someone unknown, and that the only genetic parent I definitively shared with Corinne was the man we both called father, the man who had moved to Arizona and barely maintained contact with either of us. The room had seemed to tilt then, the familiar contours of my apartment becoming strange and unsteady. I had spent 31 years understanding myself as the daughter of two specific people, inheriting my mother's analytical mind and my father's height, carrying forward family traits and tendencies that made sense within a coherent narrative of origin. And now Corinne was telling me that half of that story was simply wrong, that I was connected to my family through a biological relationship that nobody had ever acknowledged or explained. I remember asking Corinne whether she had told anyone else, particularly our mother. She had not, she said, wanting to talk to me first, wanting us to figure out together how to approach this revelation. But her voice had carried an edge of anger that I had rarely heard from her. A sense of betrayal that matched my own growing fury. Someone had lied. Someone had constructed an elaborate fiction about my origins, and had maintained it for over 3 decades. And the most likely candidate for that deception was the woman who had claimed to be my mother while knowing, perhaps all along, that she was not. Corinne had said those words at my baby shower. "That's impossible, ma'am." Not to me but to the friend who had given me the DNA kit, but the full impact of that impossibility had taken weeks to reveal itself. By the time I understood what the test had actually shown, standing in my living room at 6 in the morning while my husband slept and my pregnant body carried a child who would now inherit a mystery along with my genes, I realized that everything I thought I knew about where I came from had been built on a foundation that had just crumbled into dust. The question was no longer about ethnic percentages or distant relatives. The question was about who I actually was, and who had been lying to me about that fundamental truth for my entire life. The morning after Corinne's revelation, I went to work as though nothing had changed, which was perhaps the most surreal aspect of discovering that your fundamental understanding of your own identity had been fiction. The routine of showering, dressing in the professional uniform that finance demanded, preparing breakfast while Daniel read news on his tablet, all of it continued with the momentum of habit even as my internal landscape had been completely rearranged. Daniel had woken to find me sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the DNA results with an intensity that apparently concerned him enough to ask multiple questions. I had explained the situation in the clinical language I used for presenting complex information to executives, laying out the data points without allowing emotion to color the delivery. We share paternal DNA but not maternal DNA, which indicates my mother is not my biological mother, though we do not yet know the circumstances or who my biological mother actually is. Daniel had responded with the practical orientation that characterized most of his reactions to unexpected information. He had asked whether I was certain the test was accurate, whether there could be sample contamination or laboratory error, whether I had contacted the company to verify their methodology. When I confirmed that Corinne had already investigated these possibilities and found the results reliable, he had shifted to asking what I planned to do next, as though this were a project requiring action items rather than an existential crisis requiring emotional processing. I had not yet decided what to do, I told him, because the discovery was less than 12 hours old and I was still absorbing what it meant. He had nodded, squeezed my shoulder in a gesture meant to convey support, and suggested that I take the day off work if I needed time to process. I had declined, explaining that sitting at home would only create space for anxiety to expand, and that maintaining normal routines would help me think more clearly about how to approach the situation. The drive to my office took 30 minutes through morning traffic, a commute I had made hundreds of times while listening to financial podcasts or preparing mentally for meetings. That morning I drove in silence, watching the city pass through the windshield while my mind circled around the same questions without finding purchase on any of them. Who was my biological mother? Why had no one told me? Did my father know? Did my mother, the woman I had called mother for 31 years, know from the beginning, or had she discovered it later? Was I adopted in some informal arrangement that was never legally documented? Had there been some kind of surrogacy situation before such practices were common or regulated? Each possibility seemed equally implausible, and yet one of them had to be true. Or perhaps the truth was something I had not even considered because it existed outside the framework of normal family formation. My office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Portland, with views that stretched across the Willamette River toward the residential neighborhoods climbing the hills on the east side. I worked in a corner office that I had earned through a combination of competence and political navigation, the kind of space that signaled success to visitors and colleagues. The walls held frame degrees from universities that had prepared me for exactly this kind of career, alongside a few pieces of abstract art that Daniel and I had purchased because they seemed appropriate for professional spaces. There were photographs on my desk, carefully curated images that presented a narrative of successful adult life. My wedding photo showing Daniel and me on the steps of the venue we had rented, both of us smiling with the polished happiness that weddings demanded. A photo of Corinne and me from a vacation we had taken together 5 years earlier, standing on a beach in Mexico with our arms around each other. A photo of my mother at my college graduation, her face reflecting pride that now seemed complicated by questions about what exactly she had been proud of. I had been with the firm for 7 years, working my way from analyst to senior associate, and finally to director of a division that handled mergers and acquisitions for mid-sized technology companies. The work required analytical precision, the ability to identify risks that others missed, and the capacity to remain calm while evaluating situations where millions of dollars hung in the balance based on judgment calls about incomplete information. I was good at my job precisely because I could detach emotionally from outcomes, treating each deal as a puzzle to be solved rather than a drama to be experienced. My colleagues respected this quality even when they found it personally off-putting, and I had developed a reputation as someone who delivered reliable analysis without the emotional volatility that sometimes derailed decision-making processes. That morning I had 3 meetings scheduled: a conference call with a client considering acquisition targets, a team review of due diligence findings for a deal in progress, and a one-on-one with my manager to discuss quarterly performance metrics. I moved through each of these with the professional competence that had become automatic, presenting findings, answering questions, offering recommendations based on data analysis that left little room for interpretation. No one in those meetings would have detected that anything unusual occupied my thoughts. I had learned early in my career that personal concerns needed to be compartmentalized, that bringing emotional complexity into professional spaces signaled weakness or unreliability. The ability to perform regardless of internal state was not just valued, but required for advancement in environments where billions of dollars moved based on confidence in leadership stability. But during the spaces between meetings, alone in my office or walking through hallways to the restroom, the questions returned with renewed intensity. I found myself studying my reflection in mirrors and windows, searching for features that might offer clues about genetic origins I no longer understood. I had always assumed I resembled my mother in certain ways: the shape of my face, the color of my eyes, the way my hair grew. But now I questioned whether those resemblances were real or simply the product of expectation, the human tendency to find connection where we assume it must exist. Did I actually look like the woman I called mother, or had I convinced myself of similarities that were not genuinely present? And if I did not resemble her, why had no one in the extended family ever commented on this, never made casual observations about how I must take after my father's side or how genetics were unpredictable in their expressions? My father's family had never been particularly present in my life. He had 2 brothers who lived on the East Coast, men I had met perhaps a dozen times at weddings and funerals but with whom we maintained no ongoing relationship. His parents had died before I was born, which had always seemed like an unfortunate but unremarkable fact, the kind of generational timing that sometimes meant grandchildren never knew their grandparents. His extended family was scattered, absorbed into their own lives in ways that made annual Christmas cards the extent of our connection. I had never questioned this distance, assuming it reflected my father's general discomfort with emotional intimacy rather than anything more deliberate. But now I wondered whether the distance had been strategic, whether reducing contact with his side of the family had been a way to minimize the risk that someone might notice something unusual about my appearance or make an offhand comment that could unravel whatever story had been constructed about my origins. My mother's family had been more present but only marginally so. Her parents had divorced when she was young, mirroring the pattern she would later repeat in her own marriage to my father. Her mother, my maternal grandmother, had lived in Northern California and had visited occasionally when Corinne and I were children, though she had died when I was 14. I remembered her as a woman of strong opinions and limited patience, someone who seemed perpetually disappointed by how her life had unfolded, and who expressed that disappointment through criticism of others' choices. Her relationship with my mother had been tense, characterized by long silences punctuated by brief reconciliations that never quite took hold. My mother's father had remarried and moved to Nevada, where he started a second family that we knew virtually nothing about. He had sent birthday cards sporadically, but I had no substantial memories of spending time with him. The absence of close extended family relationships had meant that Corinne and I grew up with a sense that family consisted primarily of the four of us, and then after the divorce the three of us when we were with our mother and Robert, or just the three of us when we visited our father before he moved to Arizona. This insularity had seemed normal at the time, the way families operated in a modern world where geographic mobility and divorce disrupted traditional kinship structures. But with the DNA revelation forcing me to reconsider everything, I began to wonder whether the isolation had been more intentional than circumstantial. Had my parents deliberately maintained distance from relatives who might have known or suspected something about my origins? Had the divorce itself been connected to whatever circumstances surrounded my birth? The questions multiplied faster than any possible answers could address them. I left the office that evening around 6, driving through traffic that had thickened with the commute rush, and arrived home to find Daniel already there, working on his laptop at the dining table. He looked up as I entered, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone who was unsure what emotional state to expect. He asked how my day had been, and I told him it had been fine, productive, nothing unusual. This was technically true in terms of professional outcomes, though the statement ignored the parallel internal experience that had occupied space in my mind throughout every interaction and task. We made dinner together with the coordinated efficiency of people who had established clear divisions of labor, Daniel handling the protein while I prepared vegetables and set the table, both of us moving through familiar patterns that required minimal communication. Over dinner we discussed his current projects, a mixed-use development that was encountering zoning challenges, and a residential tower that had found unexpected complications during foundation excavation. The conversation was pleasant and engaged, the kind of exchange we had perfected over years of marriage, demonstrating interest in each other's professional lives while maintaining enough distance that work did not completely consume our limited evening hours together. Daniel asked whether I had thought more about the DNA situation, using that exact phrase as though it were a business matter requiring strategic planning, rather than a fundamental disruption of my understanding of self. I told him I was still processing the information, and had not yet decided how to approach my mother about the revelation. He had suggested, with the logical orientation that characterized his approach to problems, that I should simply call her and ask directly for an explanation. The straightforward approach, he argued, would be most efficient and would prevent me from spending weeks or months in speculation when the truth could be obtained through a single conversation. I had not immediately responded to this suggestion, recognizing its logic while also feeling resistance that I could not fully articulate. The idea of calling my mother and announcing that I knew she was not my biological mother felt both too confrontational and somehow not confrontational enough, too blunt for the magnitude of what had been hidden and yet too casual for a deception that had lasted over 3 decades. The truth was that my relationship with my mother had always been complicated in ways I had learned not to examine too closely. She was not a warm woman, not someone who expressed affection easily, or who seemed particularly interested in the emotional lives of her children beyond ensuring we met basic developmental milestones. She had provided materially, making sure we had food and clothing and opportunities for education, but she had maintained an emotional distance that sometimes felt more like tolerance than love. I had attributed this to her own difficult childhood, to the divorce from my father, to the challenges of raising 2 daughters while working full-time and managing a household. I had learned early that seeking emotional support from her was futile, that she would respond to practical problems, but had little patience for feelings that could not be resolved through action. Corinne had responded differently to this emotional unavailability, becoming more expressive and emotionally demanding as though trying to provoke some response from our mother through sheer force of feeling. I had taken the opposite approach, becoming more self-sufficient and less demonstrative, learning to manage my own emotional life without expecting recognition or validation from the woman who had raised me. This strategy had worked in the sense that it minimized conflict and earned me a reputation as the responsible daughter who did not create problems. But it had also created a relationship that felt more like a professional arrangement than a mother-daughter bond, polite and functional, but lacking the warmth that I observed in other people's family relationships. Now, with the DNA evidence suggesting that she was not my biological mother, I wondered whether the emotional distance had been connected to this hidden truth. Had she maintained detachment because I was not actually her child, because whatever circumstances had brought me into her care had been something she resented or never fully accepted? Or had the distance been present before I arrived, a fundamental aspect of her personality that would have characterized her relationship with any child regardless of biological connection? These questions felt impossible to answer without information I did not possess, and asking her directly meant confronting not just the lie about my origins, but also acknowledging the emotional absence that had defined our relationship for as long as I could remember. The pregnancy had created a strange shift in my mother's behavior over recent months, a slight warming that I had initially interpreted as excitement about becoming a grandmother. She had called more frequently, asking about doctor appointments and whether I needed anything for the baby. She had offered to come stay with me after the birth to help during the initial adjustment period, a gesture that had surprised me given her general discomfort with extended visits. At the time I had felt grateful for this increased attention, interpreting it as evidence that perhaps motherhood would soften some of the distance between us, that shared experience of raising children might create connection that had not existed before. But now I questioned whether her increased interest was related to guilt, whether she saw my approaching motherhood as something that would eventually force revelation she had been avoiding, whether she was attempting to strengthen our relationship in anticipation of the conversation we would need to have once I discovered the truth. Except she had not known I would discover the truth. The DNA test had been a joke gift at a baby shower, a spontaneous decision to open the kits immediately rather than setting them aside. If Corinne had not insisted we do the tests together, if I had simply put the kit in a drawer and forgotten about it as I might well have done given the chaos of preparing for a baby, the secret might have remained hidden indefinitely. My mother could not have anticipated that a random gift at a party would unravel decades of deception, which meant her recent attentiveness was either genuinely about becoming a grandmother to my child, or it was motivated by something else I had not yet identified. I spent that evening after dinner sitting in the nursery we had prepared, a small bedroom that we had painted pale yellow and furnished with a crib, a changing table, and a rocking chair that I had not yet used. The walls held framed prints of children's book illustrations, whimsical images of animals and forests that were meant to be soothing for an infant. I sat in the rocking chair and looked around the room, trying to imagine myself as a mother while simultaneously questioning what kind of mother I would be given that my own origins were now unclear. Would I love this child the way mothers were supposed to love their children, with the instinctive fierce protection that people described as biological imperative? Or would I discover that whatever circumstances had surrounded my own birth had somehow damaged the capacity for that kind of love, that I would recreate the emotional distance my mother had maintained with me? The questions felt dramatic even as I thought them, the kind of catastrophic thinking that I usually rejected as unhelpful speculation. But the DNA revelation had created a sense that nothing could be taken for granted anymore, that assumptions about identity and connection were more fragile than I had understood. I was carrying a child who would be biologically related to me in ways that I now questioned about myself, and I would need to decide what story to tell her about her family, what information to provide about her heritage and origins. Could I tell her about her grandmother without mentioning that this woman was not actually my biological mother? Would I be perpetuating the same deception that had been practiced on me? Or would I be protecting her from unnecessary complexity until she was old enough to understand nuance? Daniel found me in the nursery around 10 that evening, still sitting in the rocking chair though I had turned off the overhead light, and was simply sitting in the dimness created by streetlights filtering through the window. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, then sat on the floor near my feet, his back against the wall. He said that he knew I was struggling with how to process this information, and that he wanted to help but was not sure what would be useful. I appreciated his honesty about his own uncertainty, the acknowledgement that this situation did not have an obvious solution or clear path forward. We sat together in that quiet room for perhaps 20 minutes, not talking, just sharing space while my mind continued its circular processing of impossible questions. Eventually I told Daniel that I needed to call Corinne, that we needed to discuss how to approach our mother together rather than me attempting to navigate this alone. He agreed this made sense, that Corinne had been part of the discovery and deserved to be part of whatever came next. He left the nursery, giving me privacy for the call, and I dialed Corinne's number with hands that trembled slightly despite my efforts to maintain composure. She answered immediately, as though she had been waiting for my call, and her first words were to ask whether I was okay. I told her I was functioning, which was the most accurate description I could provide, and that I needed to talk about next steps. Corinne and I spent 2 hours on the phone that night, the longest conversation we had engaged in for years. We discussed whether to contact our father first or our mother, whether to approach them separately or together, whether to give them warning that we needed to have a serious conversation or to simply show up and demand answers. Corinne's anger was more visible than mine, her voice rising at several points as she described feeling betrayed not just by the lie but by the years of treating our family structure as normal when it apparently had been based on deception. She kept returning to questions about why no one had told us, what could possibly justify keeping this information hidden for over 3 decades, what right anyone had to make decisions about our identities without our knowledge or consent. I shared her anger but felt it differently, as a cold clarity rather than heat. I wanted to understand the mechanics of how the deception had been maintained, what story people had been told, who else knew the truth, and how many people had participated in the fiction either actively or through silence. I wanted to map the architecture of the lie with the same analytical precision I brought to evaluating corporate structures, identifying weak points and inconsistencies that would reveal how the system had operated. Corinne found this approach frustrating, arguing that I was intellectualizing something that demanded emotional response. But I explained that understanding the structure was how I processed shock, that clarity about logistics would eventually allow me to address the emotional dimensions once I knew what I was actually dealing with. We had finally agreed that we would approach our mother together, that Corinne would drive down to Portland that weekend, and that we would go to our mother's house in Sacramento together to confront her with the DNA evidence and demand an explanation. This united approach felt important, a way of demonstrating that we were allied in seeking truth regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. We would not warn her we were coming, would not give her time to prepare explanations or coordinate stories with anyone else who might be involved. The element of surprise seemed crucial to getting authentic responses, rather than carefully constructed narratives, designed to minimize the revelation's impact. After ending the call with Corinne, I had returned to bed where Daniel was already asleep, his breathing deep and steady in the darkness. I lay awake for hours watching shadows move across the ceiling as occasional cars passed on the street below, their headlights creating brief illumination before returning the room to darkness. My mind moved through memories of childhood, examining them for clues I had missed, searching for moments when the truth might have been visible if I had known to look for it. But memory proved unreliable for this purpose, my recollections colored by the assumptions I had carried about family relationships and biological connections. I could not trust my own past because it had been interpreted through a framework that was now revealed as fiction. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally overtook analysis and I slept fitfully, dreaming confused fragments about searching for something I could not name in houses that kept changing their layout, rooms appearing and disappearing in ways that made navigation impossible. I woke before my alarm, feeling as though I had not rested at all, and began preparing for another day of maintaining professional competence while my internal world remained completely destabilized. This was the pattern that would characterize the days between discovery and confrontation, the performance of normalcy layered over chaos, the continued execution of responsibilities while fundamental questions about identity remained unanswered. The days between discovering the DNA results and the planned confrontation with my mother stretched into a week that felt simultaneously endless and too brief. I found myself experiencing time in a distorted way, where hours at work passed in what seemed like minutes while evenings at home crawled with excruciating slowness. During this period, something shifted in how I processed memories, as though the revelation had unlocked a different way of seeing the past. Events I had categorized as ordinary family dysfunction began revealing themselves as potential evidence of the deeper deception that had structured my entire existence. What had once seemed like disconnected moments of awkwardness or emotional distance now appeared as pieces of a pattern I had been too close to recognize. I began keeping notes on my phone during this week, documenting memories as they surfaced with the compulsive thoroughness I usually reserved for work projects. These were not chronological recollections but rather fragments that emerged unpredictably, triggered by random associations or dreams that deposited me into scenes from childhood with uncomfortable clarity. The act of writing them down created a sense of control over material that otherwise felt chaotic and overwhelming. I could examine each memory as though it were data requiring analysis, searching for the truth that had been obscured by assumptions about normal family life. One memory that returned with particular intensity involved a moment from elementary school, perhaps 2nd or 3rd grade, When our class had done a unit on genetics and heredity, the teacher had assigned a project where students were supposed to create family trees showing which traits they had inherited from which relatives, using simple examples like eye color, hair texture, and whether earlobes were attached or detached. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with my mother, asking her questions about grandparents and great-grandparents so I could complete the assignment. She had been irritated by the exercise, making dismissive comments about how genetics were more complicated than elementary school projects suggested, and how the whole assignment was a waste of time that oversimplified biological reality. At the time, I had interpreted her frustration as general impatience with homework that required her involvement, consistent with her usual approach to my academic needs. She was not a mother who enjoyed crafts or projects, preferring that I handle school requirements independently unless they absolutely demanded adult participation. But now, reviewing that memory through the lens of knowing she was not my biological mother, her reaction took on different significance. She had not simply been impatient. She had been actively uncomfortable with questions about genetic inheritance, deflecting inquiries in ways that made the project difficult to complete. I had eventually given up on getting detailed information from her, and had instead invented plausible answers based on what seemed logical, creating a family tree that was as fictional as the identity I had been living with my entire life. Another memory surfaced from middle school, when I had needed to provide family medical history for a sports physical required to join the track team. The form had asked about various conditions affecting immediate family members, heart disease and diabetes and cancer, and various hereditary disorders. My mother had filled it out quickly, checking boxes with what seemed like confidence, providing information about conditions that supposedly ran in our family. But I now questioned whether any of that information had been accurate. If she was not my biological mother, then her family medical history was irrelevant to my actual genetic risk factors. Every doctor's appointment where I had reported family history, based on her information, had been contaminated by false data. Every assessment of my health risks had been calculated using the wrong variables. This realization carried immediate practical implications given my pregnancy. I had been operating under assumptions about genetic conditions I might pass to my daughter, about risks I faced during pregnancy based on what I believed to be my mother's experience with her pregnancies, about medical vulnerabilities that ran through family lines. All of that information was now suspect. I would need to contact my obstetrician and explain that the family history I had provided was inaccurate, that I actually had no reliable information about maternal genetic factors because I did not know who my biological mother was. The thought of making that phone call, of explaining the situation to medical professionals, created a specific kind of embarrassment that felt almost worse than the emotional aspects of the revelation. I remembered holidays at my mother's house during childhood, occasions when extended family gathered in ways that now seemed strange upon reconsideration. My maternal grandmother, when she was still alive, had always maintained a certain distance from me that I had attributed to her generally cold personality. She was not warm with Corinne either, so the lack of affection had seemed like a characteristic of her approach to grandchildren rather than anything specific to me. But now I questioned whether she had known I was not actually her biological grandchild, whether the distance had been deliberate rather than dispositional. Had she resented my presence? Had she questioned why her daughter was raising a child that was not hers? Or had she been kept in the dark as well, participating unknowingly in a fiction that my mother had constructed? There had been a particular Christmas when I was perhaps 9 years old, a gathering at my grandmother's house that included some of my mother's cousins and their families. I remembered one of the cousins commenting on how Corinne looked so much like our mother, while I seemed to take after our father's side. The comment had been casual, the kind of observation people make about children without particular thought. But my grandmother had responded with unusual sharpness, saying something about how genetics were unpredictable, and that it was rude to compare children's appearances. The cousin had been taken aback by the harsh response, and an awkward silence had followed before conversation moved to safer topics. At the time, I had felt vaguely uncomfortable without understanding why, sensing tension that seemed disproportionate to what had been a fairly innocuous comment. Now, replaying that exchange with knowledge of the DNA evidence, I wondered whether my grandmother had been protecting a secret she knew about, shutting down a line of conversation that might lead to dangerous observations. Or perhaps she had not known the full truth but had suspected something, and the comment about my appearance had triggered anxiety about exposure. Either way, the memory suggested that my physical dissimilarity from my mother had been noticeable to others, that people had registered the lack of resemblance even if they had not pursued the observation to its logical conclusion. I spent an evening going through old photo albums that my mother had given me years earlier. Physical books filled with pictures from the 1980s and 90s before digital photography made such artifacts obsolete. I studied pictures of myself as an infant, searching for clues about the circumstances of my birth. There were surprisingly few photos from my first year of life compared to the documentation that existed for Corinne. The pictures that did exist showed me as a baby held by my mother, but something about the images felt staged in ways I could not quite articulate. The body language seemed stiff, the expressions on my mother's face suggesting discomfort or obligation rather than joy. There was one particular photograph that captured my attention, an image of my mother holding me at what appeared to be a hospital, though the setting was ambiguous. She was sitting in a chair with me in her arms, and the photo had clearly been taken by someone else given the angle and framing. But her expression was strange, not the exhausted happiness typically associated with new mothers, but something more guarded and uncertain. Her eyes were not on me but directed slightly away from the camera, as though she was looking at something or someone outside the frame. I examined this photo for a long time, trying to determine whether I was reading too much into a single frozen moment, or whether the image actually contained evidence of reluctance or anxiety. The album also contained no pictures of my mother visibly pregnant with me, which struck me as unusual when I noticed the absence. There were several photos of her pregnant with Corinne, images that showed her at various stages of pregnancy in different settings and contexts. But for me, the visual record jumped from pictures of my mother looking normal to pictures of her holding an infant, with no documentation of the 9 months that should have preceded my arrival. This absence could have been explained by various mundane factors, lost photos or a camera malfunction, or simply different documentation habits between first and second pregnancies. But combined with everything else I now knew, the gap in the visual record suggested something more deliberate, evidence that had been carefully curated to support a particular narrative. I tried to remember whether my mother had ever told stories about her pregnancy with me, anecdotes about cravings or discomfort or preparations for my arrival. Corinne's pregnancy had generated numerous stories that got repeated at family gatherings: how our mother had craved pickles with ice cream, how she had been convinced Corinne was a boy until the ultrasound proved otherwise, how she had gone into labor 2 weeks early while shopping at the grocery store. These stories had become part of family lore, repeated enough times that even Corinne knew them despite having no memory of the events herself. But I could not recall similar stories about my mother's pregnancy with me. The narrative of my arrival had always been vague, generic statements about how I was a good baby who slept through the night early and did not cause much trouble. This lack of specific pregnancy stories now seems significant. Even if someone chooses not to share every detail, pregnancies typically generate memorable moments that become integrated into family storytelling. The absence suggested that either my mother had deliberately avoided creating false stories that might be contradicted later, or that she had no genuine pregnancy stories to share because she had not actually been pregnant with me. Either possibility pointed toward the same conclusion, that my arrival in her life had occurred through circumstances other than biological birth. I found myself studying Corinne's face during our video calls that week with an intensity that made her uncomfortable enough to ask what I was looking at. I told her I was trying to determine whether I could see family resemblances that actually existed versus ones I had imagined. We shared approximately 25% of our DNA according to the test results, the amount expected for half-siblings who share one parent. This meant that some of our features should show similarity derived from our shared father, while other aspects of our appearances should reflect our different maternal lineages. Corinne had always looked more like our mother than I did, with the same round face shape and wide-set eyes and the particular way her mouth curved when she smiled. If our mother was actually her biological mother but not mine, then those resemblances were real rather than imagined, evidence of genuine genetic connection that I did not share. Looking at my own reflection in that context, I tried to identify which features might have come from my father, and which might reflect an unknown biological mother. I had my father's height and his straight dark hair, or at least I had always assumed these traits came from him. But what other characteristics might indicate maternal heritage I knew nothing about. The shape of my nose, the structure of my cheekbones, The particular green shade of my eyes that was different from both the brown eyes my mother and Corinne shared and the blue eyes my father had. These features suddenly felt mysterious, markers of an identity that extended beyond the family I had known into territory that remained completely uncharted. During this week of memory excavation and physical self-examination, I also found myself researching the various circumstances that could result in a child being raised by someone other than their biological mother, while maintaining the fiction of biological connection. Adoption was the most obvious possibility, though typically adoptions were acknowledged rather than hidden, particularly in more recent decades. But I had been born in the early 1990s, and attitudes about adoption disclosure had been different then. Some adoptive parents had still operated under the advice that children did not need to know about their adoptive status, that love and raising were more important than biological connection, that disclosure would only create confusion or feelings of abandonment. Surrogacy represented another possibility, though the practice had been less common and less regulated in the early 90s than it would become later. Perhaps my father and mother had used a surrogate for reasons I did not understand, and had simply chosen never to disclose this to me. But this explanation seemed weak given that surrogacy typically involved the intended mother's egg, making her the biological mother even if she did not carry the pregnancy. For me to share DNA with my father but not with my mother suggested that neither the egg nor the womb had been hers, which was not the typical surrogacy arrangement. The possibility I found most disturbing but could not dismiss was that my father had conceived me with another woman outside his marriage to my mother, and that my mother had agreed to raise me as her own despite the infidelity and betrayal that my existence represented. This scenario would explain why I shared paternal DNA with Corinne but no maternal DNA, why my mother had always maintained emotional distance, why family gatherings had sometimes carried undertones of tension I had not understood. If I was the physical evidence of my father's affair, then every time my mother looked at me she would be confronted with his betrayal. The emotional distance I had experienced my entire life might have been her way of coping with raising a child who represented the worst moment of her marriage. Yet this explanation also contained inconsistencies. If my mother had been forced to raise her husband's child from an affair, why maintain the fiction that I was hers biologically? Why not simply acknowledge that she was my stepmother while my biological mother was someone else? The deception suggested something more complicated than straightforward infidelity, some circumstance that made honest disclosure impossible or dangerous. Perhaps my biological mother had been someone whose identity needed to be protected. Perhaps legal complications had required secrecy. Perhaps the circumstances of my conception involved elements that would have been scandalous or harmful if revealed. I researched support groups for late discovery adoptees, people who learned in adulthood that they had been adopted despite being raised with no knowledge of their adoptive status. The online communities I found were filled with stories that mirrored elements of my own experience. The shock of DNA testing revealing unexpected truths, the anger at parents who had maintained deception for decades, the identity confusion that came from realizing that fundamental assumptions about origin were false. Reading these accounts provided some comfort in knowing I was not alone in experiencing this particular form of identity crisis, but it also deepened my anger about the deception. The people in these support groups described years of therapy, damaged relationships with adoptive parents, ongoing struggles with trust and attachment. The consequences of the lie extended far beyond the initial revelation, creating ripples that affected every aspect of how they understood themselves and related to others. One woman's story particularly resonated with me. She had discovered at age 35 through DNA testing that her mother was not her biological mother, and when confronted, her parents had revealed that she was the product of her father's affair with a woman who had died shortly after giving birth. Her mother had agreed to raise her to avoid scandal, but had never been able to fully accept her as a daughter. The emotional distance she had experienced her entire childhood suddenly made sense, recontextualized as evidence not of her own inadequacy but of her mother's inability to overcome resentment. The woman described the revelation as simultaneously devastating and liberating, painful to understand the source of lifelong rejection, but freeing to realize it had never been about her worthiness. I wondered whether I would experience similar relief once I understood the full circumstances of my origins. The emotional distance I had experienced with my mother had always felt like something I must have caused through some failure of personality or behavior. I had learned to be more independent, more self-sufficient, less demanding, operating under the assumption that if I could just be good enough or capable enough or unproblematic enough, she might offer the warmth I observed her giving to Corinne. But if the distance had been about my origins rather than my character, then perhaps I could release decades of self-blame for failing to earn love that had never been available regardless of my efforts. This week of excavating the past and recontextualizing memories felt like archaeological work, carefully brushing away layers of interpretation to reveal structures that had always been present but hidden. Each memory I examined yielded new questions rather than answers, but the questions themselves felt important, evidence that I was actively engaging with the truth, rather than passively accepting the fiction I had been given. The process was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, a mental and emotional strain that made even simple tasks feel weighted with significance. Daniel observed my preoccupation with concern that manifested as increased attentiveness, asking more questions about how I was feeling and whether I needed anything. I appreciated his efforts while also recognizing that he could not actually help with the internal work I was doing. This was not a problem he could solve through analysis or practical action. It required sitting with uncertainty and discomfort, while waiting for information that might never fully satisfy the questions that had been generated. He did his best to provide steady presence, maintaining the routines of our life together, while giving me space to process the upheaval privately. By the end of the week, as Corinne's arrival in Portland approached and our confrontation with my mother loomed on the immediate horizon, I felt both more prepared and more uncertain than when the week had begun. I had cataloged evidence that suggested the deception had been long-standing and carefully maintained. I had identified moments when the truth might have been visible if anyone had been looking for it. I had educated myself about the various circumstances that could explain my situation and the psychological impact typically associated with late discovery of non-biological parentage. But all of this preparation could not actually protect me from whatever I was about to learn, could not cushion the impact of hearing my mother explain why she had chosen to hide my origins for over 3 decades. The patterns I had identified in my past suggested that the truth would be complicated, that simple explanations would not adequately account for the depth of secrecy that had been maintained. Whatever circumstances had brought me into my mother's care had been significant enough to justify a lifetime of deception, significant enough that she had been willing to risk exactly the kind of confrontation that was now inevitable. I did not know whether understanding those circumstances would provide relief, or simply replace one set of painful questions with another. But I knew that continuing to live without answers was no longer acceptable, that the pattern of silence and distance that had characterized my relationship with my mother needed to be broken regardless of what breaking it would cost. Corinne arrived in Portland on Friday evening, driving through rain that had persisted throughout the afternoon and showed no signs of clearing. I watched from the apartment window as her car pulled into the visitor parking space below, observing the way she sat motionless behind the wheel for several moments before gathering her belongings and stepping out into the weather. Even from this distance, I could read tension in her movements, the particular set of her shoulders that indicated she was carrying stress she had not yet found a way to process. We had been united in purpose throughout the week of phone conversations and text exchanges, aligned in our determination to confront our mother and demand truth. But seeing her physically present made the approaching confrontation feel suddenly real in ways that planning and anticipation had not fully captured. She came upstairs with an overnight bag and immediately embraced me in the doorway with an intensity that conveyed everything words could not adequately express. We stood like that for a long moment, 2 women connected by partial genetic heritage, and complete shared bewilderment about the circumstances that had shaped both our lives. When we finally separated, I saw that her eyes held the same exhaustion I had been feeling all week, the particular fatigue that comes from cycling endlessly through unanswerable questions while trying to maintain enough composure to handle daily responsibilities. Daniel greeted her warmly, taking her bag and offering coffee or wine or food, performing the host duties that allowed me to simply be present with my sister without needing to manage logistics. We sat together in the living room while Daniel retreated to his office to give us privacy, and for the first time since the DNA revelation, I felt the weight in my chest lighten slightly. Corinne represented the only other person who fully understood what this discovery meant, who had equal investment in uncovering the truth, who shared the specific form of betrayal that came from learning that fundamental family narratives had been fiction. Her presence transformed my isolated processing into something shared, creating space for conversation that did not require explanation or justification of why this mattered so profoundly. Corinne spoke first, describing how the week had unfolded for her in Seattle. She had told Marcus about the DNA results immediately after calling me that morning, unable to carry the information alone even temporarily. His response had been supportive but somewhat detached, offering practical suggestions about how to approach the situation, while not fully grasping the emotional magnitude of what she was experiencing. He had encouraged her to view it as an interesting mystery to solve rather than a personal betrayal, an approach that Corinne had found frustrating even while recognizing he meant well. The disconnect between his calm curiosity and her emotional turmoil had created distance between them throughout the week, a reminder that even supportive partners could not fully enter into experiences they had not lived themselves. She had not told her daughters anything about the situation, uncertain how to explain something she did not yet understand herself. But children sense disruption even when adults attempt to shield them from it, and both girls had asked repeatedly throughout the week whether their mother was upset about something. Corinne had deflected these inquiries with reassurances that everything was fine, creating exactly the kind of protective deception that we were preparing to confront in our own mother. The parallel had not escaped her notice, and she described feeling hypocritical for hiding truth from her children while demanding it from her parent, even though the circumstances were obviously different in scale and impact. I shared my own experience of the week, describing the memory excavation process and the patterns I had identified that now seemed like evidence of long-standing deception. Corinne listened with an expression that shifted between recognition and surprise, occasionally interjecting with her own memories that supported or complicated the interpretations I had developed. She remembered the Christmas incident with our grandmother differently than I did, recalling it as a moment when she had felt particularly loved in contrast to what seemed like rejection of me. At the time she had not questioned this differential treatment, accepting it as evidence that she was the favored grandchild without considering what that favoritism might indicate about underlying family dynamics. She described her own review of childhood photographs, noting the same absence of pregnancy pictures and the strange quality of early images showing me with our mother. But she also pointed out something I had not considered, that there were very few pictures of me with our father during my first few years of life. The photo albums contain numerous images of him holding Corinne as an infant, playing with her as a toddler, present in the domestic scenes that made up the visual record of her early childhood. But equivalent documentation did not exist for me. The pictures that did show my father and me together began when I was perhaps 3 or 4 years old, as though the relationship had started later than biology would suggest. This observation introduced a new dimension to my speculation about origins. If my father had also maintained distance from me in early childhood, it suggested that the circumstances of my arrival had been uncomfortable for him as well, not just for my mother. Perhaps I was not the product of his affair, but rather something more complicated that had required both parents to adjust to unexpected circumstances. Or perhaps his distance had been in response to my mother's distance, a way of maintaining marital unity by not appearing to favor the child who was causing tension in their relationship. Corinne had attempted to contact our father during the week, calling him twice and leaving messages that he had not returned. This was not particularly unusual given his general pattern of sporadic communication, but the timing felt significant given that we were seeking information only he could potentially provide. She had not told him explicitly what we needed to discuss, thinking that advance warning might allow him to coordinate with our mother or prepare carefully constructed explanations. But the lack of response suggested either that he was genuinely unavailable, or that he was avoiding conversation because he suspected what we wanted to know. We discussed our approach to the confrontation with our mother, which we had scheduled for the following afternoon. Corinne would drive us to Sacramento in the morning, arriving at our mother's house around noon on Saturday. We had not warned her we were coming, wanting to ensure she would be home and unprepared for the conversation we intended to initiate. The plan was straightforward in concept, but carried significant emotional complexity in execution. We would present the DNA evidence, explain what it indicated about our biological relationship, and demand a complete explanation of the circumstances that had resulted in this situation. What remained unclear was how to respond to various scenarios that might unfold. If our mother denied the evidence or claimed the tests were wrong, We would need to hold firm against gaslighting while also recognizing that DNA testing, though highly accurate, was not absolutely infallible. If she confirmed the results but refused to provide detailed explanation, we would need to decide whether to accept partial truth or push for complete disclosure regardless of her comfort. If she became emotionally overwhelmed or claimed that discussing the past would be too painful, we would need to balance compassion for whatever she had experienced against our right to know our own origins. Corinne felt strongly that we should not allow our mother to deflect or minimize the conversation, that we had waited long enough for truth and deserved complete answers regardless of how difficult providing those answers might be. I agreed with this position intellectually while also feeling some hesitation about the confrontational approach it implied. My training in corporate negotiation suggested that creating adversarial dynamics often led to defensive postures that prevented productive exchange of information. Perhaps a gentler approach that acknowledged the difficulty of the situation, while still insisting on disclosure, would be more effective than aggressive demands that might trigger shutdown or retreat. But Corinne argued that gentleness had been our default approach throughout our lives, that we had both learned to manage our mother's emotional fragility by minimizing our own needs and avoiding conversations that might create conflict. This pattern of accommodation had allowed the deception to continue for over 3 decades. Breaking the pattern required willingness to create discomfort, to prioritize our need for truth over her desire for continued secrecy. She pointed out that our mother had made choices that affected our fundamental understanding of ourselves, and that whatever consequences followed from revealing those choices were results of her actions, rather than our questions. I recognized the validity of her argument while also feeling protective of the relationship I would need to maintain with my mother after this conversation concluded, particularly given my approaching motherhood. Corinne could afford to burn bridges if necessary, because her life in Seattle provided geographic and emotional distance from our mother's daily presence. But I lived in the same state, close enough that complete estrangement would be logistically complicated and would affect my daughter's relationship with her grandmother, assuming we still use that term after learning the truth about biological connections. This practical consideration revealed something about how I was already thinking about the aftermath of revelation. I was preparing for the possibility that understanding the truth would not automatically heal the emotional distance I had experienced throughout my life, that knowing why my mother had been unable to love me warmly would not necessarily create the warmth I had always desired. The relationship might improve through honesty, or it might deteriorate further once pretense was removed. Either outcome would require navigation, choices about how much contact to maintain, and what role this woman would play in my daughter's life. We talked late into the night, moving through cycles of anger and sadness and determination that sometimes lasted minutes, and sometimes only seconds before shifting to the next emotional state. Daniel checked on us periodically, bringing food we barely touched and asking gentle questions about whether we needed anything. His presence was steadying even though he could not fully enter into what we were experiencing. At one point Corinne commented that she envied what appeared to be the stability of my marriage, the sense that Daniel provided a foundation that remained solid, even when other aspects of life felt uncertain. Her observation surprised me because I had not typically thought of my relationship with Daniel in terms of emotional support or foundation. We were partners who functioned well together, who had built a life based on compatible goals and efficient collaboration. But emotional intimacy had never been the primary characteristic of what we shared. He was present and reliable, qualities I valued highly. But I could not imagine having with him the kind of conversation Corinne and I were having, the raw excavation of feeling and memory that required vulnerability I had never learned to bring to my marriage. I said something to this effect, trying to be honest without betraying Daniel or diminishing what he did provide. Corinne listened thoughtfully and then observed that perhaps my difficulty with emotional intimacy was connected to the same patterns we were preparing to confront, that learning to be self-sufficient and emotionally independent had been a survival strategy in a family where vulnerability was not safe or rewarded. If our mother had been unable to provide emotional attunement because of complicated feelings about my origins, and if our father had been largely absent, then I would have learned early that emotional needs were burdens to be managed privately rather than shared openly. This observation landed with the force of recognition. I had always attributed my emotional reserve to personality, to some innate characteristic that made me more analytical and less expressive than other people. But perhaps it was not innate at all but rather learned, a protective adaptation to an environment where emotional expression had been met with distance or dismissal. If this was true, then the consequences of my mother's deception extended beyond the lie itself into the very structure of how I related to others, how I understood myself, how I moved through the world. The implications felt overwhelming, suggesting that even if I learned the truth about my biological origins, I would still need to do significant work to understand and potentially reshape patterns that had been established in response to circumstances I had not chosen or controlled. We eventually went to bed in the early hours of Saturday morning, Corinne in the guest room and me beside Daniel, who had fallen asleep hours earlier. I lay awake listening to the sounds of the apartment, the subtle creaks and hums that marked a structure settling into itself, and thought about the ways we were all shaped by forces we could not see or name until much later. My daughter would be born into a family whose history was more complicated than I had realized, carrying forward genetic material and psychological patterns from origins that remained partially mysterious. But she would also be born into a context where truth was valued, where questions could be asked and answers insisted upon, where deception would not be maintained for decades simply because disclosure felt uncomfortable. This thought provided some comfort as I finally drifted toward sleep. Whatever I learned the following day would be painful, but it would also be true. And truth, however difficult, provided better foundation for building a life than fiction, however comfortable that fiction might have been. The patterns of silence and distance that had characterized my family of origin did not need to be replicated in the family I was creating. I could choose different responses, different values, different ways of relating that would give my daughter something I had not received: the security of knowing that the people who raised her would tell her the truth about where she came from and who she was. When morning arrived, pale light filtering through curtains and the sounds of the city waking outside our windows, I felt a strange combination of dread and determination. The day ahead would require confronting someone I had spent my entire life trying not to upset, demanding answers she had spent decades ensuring I never sought. But Corinne and I would do this together, united in purpose if not completely aligned in approach. Whatever we learned would reshape how we understood our past, but it would also create possibility for different futures, ones not built on the foundation of unspoken secrets and careful avoidance of questions that mattered most. The drive from Portland to Sacramento stretched across nearly 10 hours when accounting for traffic and necessary stops, a journey that took us south through the Willamette Valley and into Northern California along Interstate 5. Corinne drove while I occupied the passenger seat, both of us falling into extended silences punctuated by bursts of conversation that circled obsessively around what we might learn and how we should respond to various scenarios we could not actually predict. The landscape outside shifted from the green density of Oregon forests into the drier terrain of California's agricultural heartland, vast fields stretching toward distant mountains under a sky that transitioned from overcast to brilliant clear blue as we moved south. During one of the longer silences, somewhere past Eugene as we navigated through morning traffic, I found myself experiencing an internal argument that had been building throughout the previous week, but reached new intensity as physical distance between us and our destination decreased. Part of me wanted to proceed exactly as planned, to arrive at my mother's house with Corinne and demand immediate explanations with the united force of two daughters who had been deceived. This part felt righteous anger at the betrayal, certainty that we deserved truth regardless of how uncomfortable providing that truth might be for the person who had hidden it. This was the part of me that Corinne's presence reinforced, the aspect of myself that could be brave and insistent when supported by someone who shared my grievance. But another part of me questioned whether confrontation was the most effective approach, whether aggressive demands for information might trigger exactly the kind of defensive shutdown that would prevent genuine communication. This was the part of me trained in negotiation and conflict resolution, the professional self that understood how to extract information from reluctant sources through strategic approaches that made disclosure feel safer than continued concealment. This part suggested that perhaps I should speak with my mother alone first, creating space for her to explain without the additional pressure of Corinne's presence and anger, allowing her to save face while still providing the information we needed. These two aspects of my thinking represented competing values that had coexisted uneasily throughout my adult life. The first valued justice and directness, the second valued effectiveness and strategic thinking. In professional contexts, I had learned to subordinate the desire for direct confrontation to the pragmatic goal of achieving desired outcomes through whatever means proved most efficient. But this situation was not professional. It was deeply personal, involving questions about my fundamental identity and the relationships that had structured my entire existence. Applying professional tactics to family confrontation felt simultaneously necessary and somehow wrong, as though I were treating intimate betrayal as merely another problem requiring tactical solution. I voiced some version of this internal conflict to Corinne, trying to articulate why I felt uncertain about our approach despite agreeing intellectually with her insistence on direct confrontation. She listened quietly while keeping her attention on the highway ahead, and when I finished speaking she took a long breath before responding. She said that she understood my hesitation but thought it reflected exactly the pattern we needed to break: the tendency to prioritize others' comfort over our own legitimate needs, to manage the emotional temperature of situations by suppressing our own reactions. Our mother had counted on this tendency throughout our lives, had cultivated it perhaps unconsciously through her responses to our childhood bids for attention and connection. She had taught us that her emotional fragility mattered more than our emotional needs, and we had learned the lesson so thoroughly that even now, when confronting a deception that had shaped our entire lives, I was worried about making her uncomfortable. This observation stung precisely because it contained truth I recognized but had been avoiding. My professional skills in negotiation and conflict management were legitimate and valuable, but applying them to this situation might also represent another form of the emotional suppression I had practiced since childhood. If I approached my mother gently and strategically, managing the conversation to minimize her distress while extracting needed information, I would be once again prioritizing her comfort over my own authentic response to what she had done. I would be performing capable competence while hiding the genuine hurt and anger that her deception had created. Yet even recognizing this pattern did not fully resolve my internal debate, because the question was not simply about what felt most authentic but also about what would actually produce the outcome we needed. If gentle strategic conversation would result in my mother providing complete honest information while aggressive confrontation would cause her to shut down and refuse to speak, then surely the gentle approach served our interests better regardless of whether it also happened to protect her from the full force of our anger. The goal was to learn the truth, not to punish her for hiding it, even though part of me definitely wanted to express the pain her choices had caused. But Corinne argued that separating truth-seeking from emotional expression created a false dichotomy. She believed that our mother would not provide genuine truth unless confronted with the real consequences of her deception, including our anger and hurt. Strategic gentleness might produce a carefully constructed partial explanation, designed to minimize damage while protecting whatever she considered too shameful or painful to reveal. Only by demonstrating that we were serious about demanding complete disclosure, willing to accept the relationship damage that might follow if she refused, could we create sufficient motivation for her to tell us everything rather than a sanitized version calibrated to what she thought we could accept. I wanted to believe Corinne was wrong about this, wanted to think that my mother would respond to respectful questions with respectful answers, that confrontation was unnecessary because she would recognize our right to know, and would provide information willingly once asked. But my experience of her throughout my life did not support this optimistic assessment. She had never been forthcoming about difficult topics, had never initiated conversations about emotional complexity or acknowledged mistakes she had made. Every significant piece of information I had learned about family history had been extracted through persistent questioning rather than offered voluntarily. She operated according to a philosophy that some things were better left unexamined, that discretion about painful subjects was a virtue rather than a form of dishonesty. This philosophy had extended to how she discussed the divorce from my father, an event that had obviously shaped both Corinne's and my understanding of family and relationships. When the separation had occurred, my mother had provided minimal explanation, saying simply that she and our father had grown apart, and that sometimes marriages ended without anyone being particularly at fault. She had discouraged questions about the specifics, becoming visibly uncomfortable if we asked what had gone wrong, or whether there was any possibility of reconciliation. As we grew older and might have been capable of understanding more nuanced explanations, she maintained the same vague narrative, suggesting that dwelling on the past was counterproductive, and that we should focus on adapting to our current circumstances rather than analyzing how we had arrived there. I had accepted this approach at the time, partly because I had been young when the divorce occurred and partly because pushing for information seemed to cause her obvious distress. But now I recognize that her unwillingness to discuss the divorce might have been connected to the larger secrets she was keeping. If my origins were somehow entangled with whatever had broken her marriage to my father, then honest discussion of the divorce would have required revealing information she was determined to hide. The pattern of deflection and minimal disclosure had served a protective function, ensuring that we never asked the questions that might have led to dangerous revelations. Somewhere around Reading, we stopped for lunch at a highway rest stop, sitting at a concrete picnic table and eating sandwiches we had packed that morning without particularly tasting them. The clear sky had given way to high clouds that diffused the sunlight into a pale brightness that made everything look slightly washed out. Other travelers moved through the rest area with the efficient purposefulness of people passing through rather than arriving anywhere, using facilities and returning quickly to their vehicles to continue journeys toward destinations we would never know. Corinne brought up a dimension of the situation I had been avoiding thinking about directly, which was how learning the truth about my origins might affect my pregnancy and approaching motherhood. She asked whether I had considered that my biological mother, whoever she was, might have medical history that was relevant to my pregnancy or my daughter's health. This practical concern had occurred to me during my research into family medical history, but I had not fully processed the implications. If my biological mother was alive and locatable, I would have access to information that could affect medical decision-making for both myself and my child. But learning her identity and making contact would represent a separate level of complication beyond simply understanding the circumstances of my birth. The thought of reaching out to a biological mother I had never known, explaining who I was and why I was making contact, asking for medical information and potentially opening a relationship that neither of us had chosen, felt overwhelming in ways I could not fully articulate. I was preparing to confront the woman who had raised me about why she had hidden my origins. The idea of simultaneously navigating a relationship with a biological mother, who had given me up or been separated from me through circumstances I did not yet understand, seemed like more emotional complexity than I could reasonably manage while also preparing to give birth and become a mother myself. But Corinne pointed out that I might not have the luxury of addressing these complications sequentially. If my biological mother was elderly or ill, delays in making contact could mean losing access to information or relationship possibilities permanently. If there were genetic conditions that ran in her family, knowing about them sooner rather than later could affect prenatal care or early childhood medical decisions. The practical implications created pressure to move quickly, even though the emotional implications suggested taking time to process each revelation before moving to the next level of complexity. I found myself resenting the false urgency this created, the sense that circumstances beyond my control were dictating timelines and forcing choices before I felt prepared to make them. None of this was my fault. I had not chosen to be born under mysterious circumstances. I had not decided to hide my origins from myself. I had not created the situation where DNA testing at a baby shower would reveal that my entire understanding of my family was based on deception. Yet I was the one who would bear the consequences of others' choices, who would need to navigate the emotional and practical complications while also managing a demanding career and preparing for motherhood. The unfairness of this felt acute, a specific kind of anger at being forced to clean up a mess I had not made. Corinne acknowledged the unfairness but suggested that focusing on it would not change the reality we faced. We could be angry about the situation, and that anger was completely justified, but we also needed to make decisions about how to move forward given the circumstances as they actually existed rather than as we wished they could be. This was pragmatic advice that I would have offered to someone else in similar circumstances, but receiving it from my sister while sitting at a rest stop halfway to a confrontation I was dreading made me feel defensive rather than supported. I said something sharp in response, pointing out that she was not the one whose identity had been revealed as fiction, that she still knew who both her biological parents were, and could proceed with her life without needing to question fundamental assumptions about where she came from. Her situation was certainly affected by the revelation, but it was not equivalent to mine. She was discovering that our mother had lied, which was significant. But I was discovering that the woman I had called mother for 31 years was not actually my mother at all, which represented a different order of disruption entirely. Corinne accepted this distinction without argument, acknowledging that my experience of the revelation was more fundamentally destabilizing than hers. But she also pointed out that she was giving up her weekend, driving 10 hours round trip, and preparing to have a difficult confrontation with our mother specifically to support me through this process, not because she needed answers for her own sake. She was here because she loved me and because she thought I should not have to face this alone, but that did not mean she could fully understand or experience what I was feeling. The best she could offer was presence and solidarity, which she was providing even though it required her to navigate her own complicated emotions about our mother's deception. Her response deflated my defensive anger, replacing it with gratitude that felt uncomfortably vulnerable. I was not accustomed to acknowledging need or accepting support that I had not explicitly requested, had spent most of my life cultivating independence precisely to avoid situations where I would need to rely on others' goodwill or assistance. But this situation exceeded my capacity to manage alone, and Corinne's willingness to show up despite her own discomfort represented a form of care I had experienced rarely enough that I did not quite know how to receive it gracefully. I apologized for the sharpness of my previous comment, explaining that I was frightened about what we might learn and was displacing that fear into irritation at smaller things. She accepted the apology easily, without making me feel worse about having needed to offer it, and suggested we continue driving so we could arrive before late afternoon. We returned to her car and merged back onto the highway, the remaining hours to Sacramento feeling both too long and not nearly long enough. As we approached the outskirts of the city where I had grown up, familiar landmarks began appearing that carried complex associations. The exit for the neighborhood where I had attended high school, the shopping center where I had worked a retail job during college summers, the series of developments that had expanded substantially since I had last visited, but still retained recognizable features. This was the landscape of my childhood and adolescence, the physical context in which I had formed my earliest understanding of who I was, and how I fit into the world. Returning to it now, knowing that fundamental elements of that understanding had been false, created a strange sense of dislocation. The places looked the same but meant something different, familiar and foreign simultaneously. My mother lived in a modest house in a subdivision that had been built in the 1980s, a neighborhood of similar single-story homes with small yards and attached garages. She had moved here after the divorce, downsizing from the larger house where Corinne and I had spent our childhood. The neighborhood was quiet on this Saturday afternoon, most houses showing signs of habitation but no visible activity, residents presumably inside or away running errands. We pulled into the driveway behind my mother's car, confirming she was home as we had hoped. The house looked exactly as it had during my last visit several months earlier, the same slightly overgrown landscaping and faded paint on the garage door, the same collection of potted plants on the small front porch. Neither Corinne nor I moved to get out of the car immediately. We sat in the driveway with the engine off, both of us staring at the front door of the house as though it might reveal what waited inside if we looked at it long enough. I could feel my heart beating faster than normal, a physical manifestation of anxiety that I tried to control through the breathing techniques I had learned for managing stress during high-pressure work situations. But those techniques had been developed for dealing with professional challenges where the stakes were financial rather than existential, and they felt inadequate for managing the fear of learning truths that would fundamentally alter how I understood my own life. Corinne reached over and took my hand, squeezing it in a gesture of solidarity that required no words. We sat like that for perhaps a minute, drawing strength from physical connection before we would need to walk through that door and demand answers to questions we had never been allowed to ask. Whatever happened in the next hours would change everything, would end the fiction that had sustained our family relationships for decades, and replace it with truth that might be more painful than the comfortable lies we had been living. But there was no turning back now, no way to unknow what the DNA test had revealed, no possibility of returning to the innocent assumption that the people who raised us had told us the truth about where we came from. Finally, Corinne released my hand and opened her door, stepping out into the mild Sacramento afternoon. I followed her out of the car and up the walkway to the front porch, each step feeling weighted with significance that was probably only visible to us. This was it, the moment we had been planning and dreading, the confrontation that would force my mother to explain what she had hidden for my entire life. I raised my hand and knocked on the door, 3 firm strikes that echoed in the quiet neighborhood, and waited for her to answer. My mother opened the door wearing reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, and an expression that shifted rapidly from mild curiosity to visible alarm as she registered both of us standing on her porch. She had clearly not expected visitors, particularly not both daughters arriving unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. Her hand remained on the doorknob as though she might close it again, her body language communicating uncertainty about whether to welcome us or question why we had come. The moment stretched uncomfortably before she finally stepped back and gestured us inside with a question about whether everything was all right, whether something had happened that required us to drive all this way without calling first. Corinne responded that we needed to talk about something important, her tone carrying enough weight that our mother's expression shifted from concern to something closer to apprehension. We followed her into the living room, a space I knew well from previous visits but which now felt strange and staged, as though I were seeing it for the first time rather than entering a familiar environment. The furniture was arranged exactly as it had been for years, the same floral couch and matching armchair, the same coffee table with its collection of magazines and remote controls, the same family photographs displayed on shelves and walls showing various stages of our lives. Those photographs now felt like evidence in a case I was building, documentation of a narrative that I knew to be partially false. My mother sat in her usual chair while Corinne and I took positions on the couch, creating a physical arrangement that felt like an interrogation even though no one had explicitly framed it that way. The afternoon light came through the window behind our mother, making her face slightly difficult to read while leaving us fully illuminated. I wondered whether she noticed this dynamic, whether she felt exposed or defensive before we had even begun speaking. She asked again what this was about, her voice taking on a quality I recognized from childhood as precursor to irritation, the tone she used when she felt her time was being wasted or her patience tested. Corinne pulled out her phone and opened the DNA testing application, turning the screen toward our mother to show the results indicating that we were half-siblings rather than full siblings. She explained what this meant in genetic terms, that we shared approximately 25% of our DNA rather than the 50% expected from sisters who had the same mother and father. She described how the detailed analysis showed that we did not share maternal haplogroups, which meant we had different biological mothers despite having been raised as full sisters. Throughout this explanation, Corinne's voice remained steady and factual, presenting information rather than making accusations, giving our mother opportunity to respond without backing her into a defensive corner. Our mother's face had gone pale while Corinne spoke, all color draining from her cheeks in a way that might have concerned me under different circumstances. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair tightly enough that her knuckles showed white against her skin. She did not speak immediately when Corinne finished, instead staring at the phone screen as though the data displayed there might change if she looked at it long enough. The silence extended beyond comfort into something that felt almost unbearable, charged with tension that came from everyone in the room, knowing that whatever came next would fundamentally alter our relationships regardless of what specific words were spoken. Finally, my mother asked where we had gotten these tests, her voice thin and strained. Corinne explained about the baby shower gift and our decision to complete the tests together, information that seemed to register with our mother as both explanation and additional betrayal. She closed her eyes briefly as though processing pain, then asked what we wanted from her, what we expected her to say about results from some commercial DNA tests that probably were not even accurate. The defensive deflection was exactly what Corinne had predicted, an attempt to question the validity of the evidence, rather than address what it revealed. I spoke for the first time since entering the house, my voice coming out calmer than I felt. I explained that we had verified the accuracy of the results with the testing company, that the certainty level was over 99%, that this was not a mistake or contamination but rather legitimate evidence of biological relationship that contradicted what we had been told our entire lives. I said that we were not here to accuse her of anything but simply to understand the truth about my origins, to learn the circumstances that had resulted in this situation. I tried to keep my tone neutral and non-confrontational, hoping that presenting this as an information-gathering conversation, rather than an attack, might make honest disclosure feel safer. But my mother's response revealed that she was not prepared to provide easy explanations or willing cooperation. She said that the past was complicated and that some things were better left alone, that digging into history that could not be changed would only create pain without serving any useful purpose. She suggested that knowing I had been loved and cared for should be sufficient, that the biological details of how I had come into her life were less important than the fact that she had raised me and provided everything I needed. This argument echoed the philosophy she had maintained throughout my childhood about avoiding difficult conversations, the belief that emotional discomfort justified continued ignorance. Corinne's response was immediate and sharp, her voice rising as she pointed out that this was not some minor historical detail, but rather fundamental information about identity that everyone deserved to know. She said that our mother had no right to decide what information we could access about our own origins, that keeping secrets about something this significant was a form of control that had damaged both of us in ways she apparently could not or would not acknowledge. The confrontational approach I had worried about was manifesting exactly as I had anticipated. With our mother's face closing into the expression of rigid defensiveness, I remembered from every childhood conflict that had escalated beyond her comfort threshold. I intervened before the conversation could deteriorate completely into accusation and counteraccusation. I acknowledged that discussing this must be difficult, and that I understood she might have reasons for having kept this information private. But I explained that I was pregnant and needed accurate medical history for my own health and my daughter's well-being, that operating with false information about genetic heritage could have serious medical consequences. I presented this as a practical necessity rather than simply emotional need, thinking that framing the request in terms of health and safety might make compliance feel more justified than refusing. This approach seemed to penetrate her defenses slightly. Her expression shifted from rigid resistance to something more conflicted, as though she was weighing competing obligations or fears. She asked how far along I was, whether everything was progressing normally with the pregnancy, questions that felt like deflection but also like genuine concern. I answered that I was 7 months along and that so far everything appeared healthy, but that I needed complete and accurate family medical history to ensure I was not missing important risk factors. I said that whatever circumstances had surrounded my birth, I needed her to tell me the truth now because the stakes were no longer just about satisfying curiosity but about protecting my child. My mother stood abruptly and walked to the window, standing with her back to us while she looked out at the quiet street. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier charged pauses, less defensive and more weighted with something I could not quite identify. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that I had to strain to hear her. She said that she had never intended for us to find out this way, that she had thought the truth would remain hidden, and that everyone would be better off for that continued ignorance. She said that what she was about to tell us would change how we understood our family, and that once she said it, there would be no taking it back, no returning to the comfortable fictions that had protected everyone from painful realities. Corinne said that we were already past the point of comfortable fictions, that the DNA results had destroyed whatever protection ignorance had provided, and that we needed complete truth regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. Our mother turned from the window to face us, and I saw tears on her cheeks though her expression remained controlled. She said that she was not my biological mother, which we already knew, but that the circumstances were more complicated than we probably imagined. She asked whether we were certain we wanted to hear everything, whether we had considered that some truths were more painful than the questions they answered. I told her that we were certain, that we had already processed the shock of learning she was not my biological mother, and that whatever additional information she provided could not be more destabilizing than what we had already discovered. This was probably not entirely true, but I needed to project confidence to prevent her from using our potential emotional fragility as justification for continued withholding. She nodded slowly, returned to her chair, and began speaking in a voice that carried the careful quality of someone who had rehearsed this conversation mentally many times without ever expecting to actually have it. She explained that my father had had an affair during his marriage to her, that this much we might have already guessed. The affair had resulted in pregnancy, and the woman involved had been someone they both knew, which complicated the situation in ways that a stranger would not have. She paused here as though expecting questions, but both Corinne and I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. She said that the woman had died in childbirth, that complications during delivery had resulted in massive hemorrhaging, that the hospital had not been able to control. I had survived while my biological mother had not, creating a situation where my father was suddenly responsible for an infant whose existence represented his infidelity, and whose mother could not raise me. The information landed with physical force, as though I had been struck. My biological mother was dead. She had been dead since the moment I was born. The fantasy I had been constructing about potentially making contact, about learning her medical history directly, about possibly developing some kind of relationship, evaporated instantly. Whatever questions I had about her could never be answered by her directly, but only through second-hand accounts from people who had known her. I felt Corinne's hand reach for mine, gripping tightly as she processed this information alongside me. My mother continued speaking, explaining that my father had begged her to raise me as her own, that he had been desperate and terrified about what would happen to an infant whose mother was dead and whose father was married to someone else. She said that she had been devastated by the affair and had initially refused, that the thought of raising her husband's child with another woman had felt like an impossible betrayal to accept. But he had worn her down through a combination of pleading and practical arguments about what would happen to me otherwise, about how adoption through official channels would create public scandal, about how raising me would allow them to maintain the appearance of their marriage while actually providing me with a stable home. She had agreed eventually, though she described the decision as something she had never fully made peace with. She had faked the final months of pregnancy by wearing increasingly elaborate clothing and avoiding situations where her supposed pregnancy would be scrutinized too closely. I had been born in a hospital several hours away, with only my father present, and she had claimed me as her own through a process she did not fully explain but which had apparently involved falsified documentation and perhaps bribed officials. This had occurred in an era before digital record-keeping made such deceptions more difficult, when paperwork could be manipulated more easily by people with sufficient motivation and resources. The story felt simultaneously shocking and somehow inevitable, explaining numerous details about my childhood that had never quite made sense. The lack of pregnancy photos was because there had been no pregnancy. The distance she had always maintained was because I represented her husband's infidelity every time she looked at me. The strange gaps in family medical history were because she genuinely did not know my biological mother's background well enough to provide accurate information. Every piece of evidence I had cataloged during my week of memory excavation now had context that made the pattern comprehensible even as it remained painful. I asked who my biological mother had been, what her name was, what she had been like. My mother hesitated before answering, as though even now she wanted to protect this information. But Corinne's sharp reminder that we had a right to know everything prompted her to continue. She said my biological mother's name had been Catherine Chan, that she had been a colleague of my father's at the engineering firm where he had worked during the early years of their marriage. She described Catherine as intelligent and ambitious, someone who had been pursuing a graduate degree while working full-time, someone my father had connected with intellectually in ways that apparently his marriage had not provided. The affair had lasted approximately 8 months before Catherine discovered she was pregnant. According to my mother's account, Catherine had wanted to keep the baby and had told my father she expected him to leave his marriage and help her raise the child. My father had been unwilling to do this, had tried to convince Catherine to terminate the pregnancy or give the baby up for adoption. But Catherine had refused both options, insisting that she would raise the child with or without his involvement. The situation had reached an impasse when Catherine went into labor 5 weeks before her due date, experiencing complications that escalated rapidly into a medical emergency neither she nor anyone else had anticipated. My mother's voice became strained as she described receiving the phone call from my father at the hospital, how he had told her that Catherine was dying, and that he had a daughter who would have no mother unless someone stepped in to care for her. She said that in that moment she had faced a choice between allowing an innocent infant to go into the foster system, while her father dealt with the legal and social consequences of an affair that had produced a child, or accepting me into her home and allowing the fiction that I was hers to protect everyone involved. She had chosen the latter option despite knowing it would mean raising the physical evidence of her husband's betrayal, despite knowing she would struggle to love me the way a mother should love a child she had carried and birthed. I sat absorbing this information while trying to process the layers of tragedy and deception it represented. My biological mother had died bringing me into the world, dying alone in a hospital while giving birth to a child whose father had refused to leave his marriage for her. The woman who raised me had done so out of a combination of coercion and perhaps some measure of compassion, but had never been able to overcome the resentment that my existence generated. My father had created this entire situation through his affair, and then had essentially forced his wife to clean up the consequences while he maintained the appearance of respectable family life. Every person in this scenario had made choices that seemed understandable from certain perspectives, while also being deeply flawed and ultimately harmful. Corinne asked why they had never told me, why they had maintained this fiction for over 3 decades when disclosure at any point would have been less traumatic than allowing me to discover the truth through a random DNA test. Our mother said that initially they had planned to tell me when I was older, when I could understand the complexity of adult relationships and forgive the choices that had been made. But as years passed and the lie became more entrenched, the prospect of disclosure became increasingly frightening. She worried that I would hate her for not being my real mother, that I would reject the only family I had ever known, that the revelation would destroy whatever relationship we had managed to build despite the difficult foundation it rested on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.